السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. اعتداءات 13 من نوفمبر تشرين الثاني في باريس يراها البعض من ضمن أجندة الدولة العميقة في فرنسا، فماذا أريد من وراء هذه العملية ومن المستفيد من خلف الستار؟ مع الكاتب السياسي غيرويد اوكلمان من الداخل. معكم زينب الصفار، تابعونا. هل ما جرى ويجري في باريس من هجمات إرهابية هو نتاج آخر من عملية غلاديو ضد الشعب الأوروبي في محاولة ماكرة للتلاعب بالصورة العامة فضلاً عن المشهد السياسي والإقليمي كما يرى المراقبون؟ فما هي عملية غلاديو؟ غلاديو أو السيف الروماني القصير بالإيطالية هو اسم منظمة سرية أنشأها حلف الناتو في إيطاليا في أعقاب الحرب العالمية الثانية أواخر الأربعينيات. هذه العملية تمثلت في تشكيل قوات سرية في الدول الأوروبية مولت عملياتها وكالة الاستخبارات المركزية الأمريكية CIA والبريطانية MI6 وبعض المخابرات الغربية الأخرى. مهمة هذه القوات كانت تدبير وشن عمليات إرهابية ضد المدنيين في الدول الأوروبية ونسبتها إلى القوى اليسارية الأوروبية. وفي إطار هذه العملية قامت هذه القوات السرية بالفعل بشن مئات العمليات الإرهابية في البرتغال وألمانيا وإيطاليا وإسبانيا وباقي الدول الأوروبية. وشملت هذه العملية أيضاً تمويل إرهابيين من اليمينيين المعادين للشيوعية وتزويدهم بالمتفجرات لشن العمليات الإرهابية. الفكرة الجوهرية وراء عملية غلاديو هذه تمثلت في أنه إذا لم توجد عمليات إرهابية يمكن الاحتجاج بها، فإنه يجب خلق وتدبير هذه العمليات. أحد الذين شاركوا في هذه العملية قال: كان علينا أن نهاجم المدنيين من الأبرياء نساء وأطفالا والذين لا علاقة لهم بلعبة السياسة، والهدف هو إجبار هؤلاء على أن يلجأوا إلى الدولة طلبا للحماية في مواجهة الإرهاب المزعوم للقوى اليسارية. ويعتقد موقع جلوبال ريسيرش الكندي أنه يتم استخدام تنظيم القاعدة وكذلك داعش لأغراض مختلفة في وقت ترغب فيه البلدان الأوروبية بالتدخل بشكل سريع في البلدان العربية باستخدام المرتزقة الأجانب. فمثلا أولاند يدين هجمات باريس، ولكن في الوقت نفسه من جهة أخرى لا يزال يسلح ويدعم المجموعات المسلحة التي نشأت من أجل مواصلة حملة العنف والإرهاب في سوريا. غيرويد اوكلمان الكاتب والمحلل السياسي الإيرلندي في باريس يكشف من الداخل عن أجندة الدولة العميقة التي تقف برأيه خلف اعتداءات باريس، ويتحدث عن أزمة اللاجئين القسرية المتفاقمة في أوروبا. غيرويد اوكلمان, writer and political analyst based in Paris. Welcome to the Inside, sir. Well, غيرويد, you have revealed after Friday the 13th attacks in Paris that the deep state agenda is behind those attacks. Who benefits from those attacks, and why did you resort into saying that there is a deep state agenda behind them?
Well, I think you have to look at foreign policy, French foreign policy first, and sort of put the actual attacks that happened in Paris in brackets for a moment and just look at foreign policy and see, well, what have the French been doing for the last 5 years in Syria and previously in Libya and other war theatres. And if you look at what the French have been doing in Syria for the last 5 years now, they've been supporting militants who they describe as moderates, and they are effectively Al-Qaeda terrorists. So the French have been supporting the Al-Nusra Front and have been more or less admitting it. I mean, the French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius has said, he's on record stating that Al-Nusra were doing a good job in Syria. It has also been, condemned by senior French diplomats such as Philippe de Villiers, who recently said that it was absolutely disgraceful policy. So if you have a state that is supporting terrorism abroad, that state cannot claim to be fighting terrorism at home. So in a sense, what, you know, I mean, if you look at the French allies in the war in Syria, you have Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey. The French media openly admits that the Turks have been supplying weapons to the Islamic State. There was an article on the 12th of February in Le Monde, and in that article the journalist refers to the chief of intelligence, of Turkish intelligence, who is a very close confidant of Erdogan. She refers to the fact that he was supplying weapons to the Islamic State in Syria, and that he was the architect, if you like, of the Islamic State operation in Syria. NATO is a member of, or Turkey is a member of NATO. So that means Turkey is backing the Islamic State, which means NATO is complicit in backing the Islamic State. I mean, so the deep state agenda is really the cover-up that the media have been complicit in the support of French support of terrorism in the Middle East. And of course, we could go back to Libya, where again for over eight months the French supported Al-Qaeda, the Libyan Islamic fighting group. They've done this pretty much all over Africa. In the Central African Republic, you had French covert support for the Seleka terrorists there. You had French complicity in the destabilization of Mali subsequent to the Libyan war. They've supported different types of terrorists all over Africa. In Cote d'Ivoire in 2010, they kidnapped the democratically elected president of that country. And again, the French had supported terrorists in Cote d'Ivoire for many, many years, since 2002, in fact. So you have a lot of collusion with terrorists in French foreign policy. So that's the first thing you need to just look at, and I don't think there's any question about that now.
غيرويد, what was it intended to achieve, those operations that took place here in France?
Well, I think it's the objectives have been stated clearly by the French government. That is to say, roll back democratic freedoms. The Islamic State, according to the French government, wants to take away our freedoms. It wants to, it is envious, the Islamic State is envious of our freedoms. If you look at it from a class perspective, what has been happening in Europe since 2008? Well, the political and financial elites have themselves declared that there is a class war. There is a class war going on. You are seeing austerity being introduced right across Europe, so you've got massive unemployment and poverty. So in that kind of austerity state, the only way in which political elites can continue to govern is through terror. And so terror has always been a function of tyranny. And of course, I think nobody can deny that, you know, we are now governed by oligarchs, and that essentially the gap between the rich and poor is so great that there's really no democratic oversight of what these people are doing. And these people would have absolutely no qualms if they can support head choppers and psychopaths all over Africa and in Syria. They would have no hesitation in doing the same here if it meant that it would drum up support for further foreign interventions, and would also distract the public from the real impending financial doom. I mean, there is a very serious threat of the banks going bankrupt in Europe. And if that happens, you will have major social revolt. So there is a logic of militarization that has been growing over the years. We don't live in a social state. We're living increasingly in a penal state. And so there's a penalization going on. And there's a very clear class divide. And of course, if you look at France, the class divide also has an ethnic aspect to it. I mean, increasingly, you have a very powerful, rich Judeo-Christian elite, and you have a pauperized, majority Muslim working class. So there is a very clear class, but also an ethnic element. And so the way in which you rule is by increasing ethnic and racial tension among the working classes. And so what better way to do that than to create the sort of scapegoat of the Arab terrorist.
Right. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts also echoed some of your argument by, and he's the associate editor of the Wall Street Journal. He has explained that such an attack is beyond the capability of most organizations and requires capability that is unlikely to be in ISIL's arsenal. An attack on this scale is difficult to pull off without authorities getting wind or notice of it. The coordination required suggests state involvement.
The thing is, of course, there's state involvement in the sense that if the French are supporting terrorists in Syria, then they're complicit in terrorism. So it would be logical to be very suspicious of the activities of the French security services.
Right.
The thing is, this is a nuclear power. France is not a banana republic. It is a nuclear power, and a nuclear power is a country that is capable of guarding weapons of mass destruction. It has a very high level of security.
True.
And I think some guy sitting in front of his television smoking hash and walking down the street and drinking whiskey doesn't come across to me as being someone who would be capable of threatening the French state. If a nuclear power can be threatened by someone like that, I think, then there's very serious questions in terms of the logistics and organizing security. So.
In line with this argument, غيرويد, well-informed media reports indicate that all of the terrorists involved with the Paris attacks were European nationals, previously fighting in Syria alongside al-Nusra Front, and then moved to Al-Raqqa, and of course to join the so-called ISIS. Finally, they moved to Qunaitira, Dar'a, and their last station was in the Zionist entity, Israel, at a site called Beit Zora, where they have been trained by the Israeli Mossad. They were then sent to France just 6 months before the Paris attack incident. The question is here, how could such a terrorist group violate secured places like the stadiums and like the concert halls without any assistance from the foreign intelligence?
Well, of course, I mean, the link with the Mossad is very telling, because I mean, Israel is probably one of the only foreign powers that has actually ever attacked France. They attacked France in 1980. They actually bombed a factory that was creating munitions parts for creating parts for the nuclear plant in Iraq. And the Mossad bombed the factory in France that was making those parts in 1980, and they threatened French engineers. The French engineers who were working in Iraq were actually given death threats by the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service and their families. And that attack was blamed on ecologists. So they created the false flag attack. They blew up a French factory. They blamed ecologist extremists for it, and then they created a pseudo-Islamic group which they used to send death letters to French engineers. That's the only foreign countries, as far as I can tell, that has actually openly dared to attack France.
Right.
Now, if you were to ask, who benefits from these attacks, of course, the Israeli lobby benefits from it. I mean, in the media reports straight after the attack, you could hear, experts praising Israel. We need to take an approach towards terrorism like the Israelis, similar to the Israelis. We need to be more. We need to learn more from the Israelis. So I mean, the demonization of Muslims, the idea of the Muslim stereotype as extremist, crazy nutcase, that is exactly what justifies the Israeli operations against Gaza, because any kind of resistance to Israel is equated with people who are out of their mind, and that is in other words, the real threat to Israel in the Middle East has always been people like Bashar al-Assad. These are people that are intelligent, they have democratic mandate, they have open, tolerant societies. Very difficult to present as a guy who's out of his mind. The kind of guys that actually serve Zionist policies in the Middle East are people like Baghdadi. These are people, of course, they stand for absolutely nothing except death and destruction. And if you can make people believe that all Muslims are associated with that, then Israel can do whatever it wants in Gaza. I mean, we saw this in January. I mean, the Je suis Charlie demonstration was pretty much an entirely Israeli affair. I mean, you had Netanyahu leading the charge in Paris.
The Republican March.
And the thing about the Israelis is that because they control the press, and they prevent us from talking about it and threaten us. You know, I mean, they threaten people with anti-Semitism and so on. They can get away with a lot. I mean, but they often tend to do too much. I mean, it was just too obvious that the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January were very much in Israel's interest, and they're not very subtle. The Israelis, they seem to almost like to kind of
to try to allure the Jews of France to
to leave.
Moved into Israel.
Well, there's another thing that you're actually seeing is, I mean, if you look at
the Aliyah.
If you look at what is happening in the Middle East, what you know, you've got all of these states around Israel have been destroyed by terrorism and supported by Israel and NATO. So you've got Syria, and you know the project is to divide Syria into 4 parts, the old French colonial model, divided into failed states, and then it can no longer pose a threat to the Zionist entity. You have Libya completely overrun now. It's basically just a terrorist base for all sorts of covert operations in Africa and the Middle East. You've got the constant covert war going on in Egypt, where Copts are being attacked, and where you've got the sectarian war. This is very much in accordance with the Yenon Plan, which was published in 1982 by Odedin, the Israeli state official. And you have this movement of depopulation taking place in the Middle East, and at the same time Netanyahu is coming to Europe saying to Jews, you know, get the hell out of here, because it's like this isn't going to be a good place to live. You know? So you can see there's something very strange. There's kind of Jews are leaving Europe while Arabs are being forced to come here and leave their lands, like we're seeing with the refugee crisis. So there's a kind of...
We will talk a bit about all this a bit further after the break, and we'll also talk a bit more about the aftermath of the Paris attacks and the fight against Daesh and Operation Gladiator, but after the break. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا.
يرى المراقبون أن الحكومة الفرنسية ترغب في تدمير نظام الأسد في أسبقية لحاجتها إلى القضاء على داعش، ويتفاخر الفرنسيون في أنهم قصفوا الرقة عاصمة داعش السورية 20 مرة. فلماذا لم يقم الفرنسيون بذلك قبل أسبوعين أو شهرين؟ غيرويد اوكلمان الكاتب والمحلل السياسي في باريس، هل يعتقد فعليا أن الحكومة الفرنسية تريد القضاء على داعش؟
I think the Russians seem determined to destroy the Islamic State, or ISIL, or Daesh.
The so-called Islamic State.
The so-called Islamic State, yeah. I mean, the nomenclature tends to change all the time. The Russians do seem determined, and they have been determined. They've done a lot, of course. I mean, in 2 weeks they did more than the Western coalition achieved in an entire year. The Islamic State is still important for NATO, I think, in Syria. They do want to get rid of Assad. That hasn't changed. They do want to break Syria up into 4 parts. Remember that the real power behind NATO policy is Israel. It's Israel's interest, and they're fanatical. They will not, they will not tolerate a Syria that is coherent and is capable of resisting Israeli hegemony in the region. So I think the Islamic State you are seeing kind of a phony war, I think, developing between Russia and the West right now, where ostensibly they're allies. And at the same time, you have the Turks, NATO member, shooting down Russian planes because they're afraid that the Russians are destroying their terrorists, essentially, in Syria. You have, I think there is an element of dispute happening in NATO. There's certainly the smaller NATO countries are trying to get out. I mean, Hungary, for example, is a member of NATO. They openly admitted that they're sick and tired of what's going on. And so,
excuse me, Geroid. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has said that George Soros, an American billionaire and human rights advocate, was responsible for the ongoing refugee crisis. What's your take concerning this coercive engineered?
It's part of the attempt to uproot people all over the world. So you have, for example, all of the people in that what Dimitri Katsikis, the Greek historian and Turkologist, described as the intermediate region, Mauritania to the Horn of Africa to to Middle East, Central Asia, and up into Eastern Europe and Russia. That whole region has been destabilized since 2011. Now, the US strategy for Europe for this century is to literally try and dump as many people from the south right up in the north. So this goes back to Thomas P.M. Barnett, who's a US grand strategist, and he's written books where he's kind of said that there's going to be massive flows of population from the African continent, from Middle East and Asia, particularly into Europe. And this is not has nothing to do with natural forces as such. It's actually more of a strategy to destabilize Europe. The Americans have understood for a long time that Germany is still an occupied country by the United States. It still has massive US military presence and has no official foreign policy other than sort of being a member of NATO and has gone along with NATO. The Germany's long-term interests are unification or rapprochement, if you like, with Moscow. In other words, the only way the Germans can expand the economy in this century is through integration with Eurasia, with China and Russia. And the main market for German cars nowadays is China. So opening up to Iran, China and Russia and solving the gas and pipeline problems of the Middle East are definitely in Germany's strategic economic interest. And if Germany does that, of course, that will mean that the Eurasian continent, the European peninsula, will finally unite with the Eurasian continental landmass. And that will mean the end of US hegemony. The US will no longer be able to control Europe. Pilsudski had another idea, which he called neo-Prometheanism, which was basically neo-Prometheanism was to support every kind of secession movement in the Russian Federation, inside Russia. Today would be the Russian Federation, but back then it was the Soviet Union.
Sure.
But to support independence movements inside the Soviet Union, today inside the Russian Federation. So you're seeing, you will see destabilization of the North Caucasus region.
Sure.
You will see also inside Russia you have huge demographic problems. There's demographic deficit in Russia.
The way they supported also certain NGOs in Hong Kong to trying to destabilize.
Yes, and you have lots of ethnic minorities in Russia. So the United States strategy is to, if they succeed in Syria, then they will obviously move that into Central Asia and Russia.
Allow me to wrap up with a quote for Alistair Crook, who's a former British diplomat. He indicated that what the Europeans want more than anything, however, is a political settlement that might staunch the flow of refugees to Europe. They may see that Russia has a better chance of achieving that through open elections in Syria, and they may fear America's Assad must go first formula might end in a chaos that exacerbates the refugee flight, and they will have to choose. غيرويد اوكلمان, writer and political analyst, many thanks indeed for joining us from Paris.
You're welcome.
You're most welcome, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة، ودائما من الداخل. المزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@الميادين.net، وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك من الداخل، من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من العاصمة الفرنسية باريس. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.